Okay, so I quite often get asked what it's like to work in a corporate organization as a designer or innovator or whatever. And of course, I've worked at Dyson and Lego most recently, but I thought there was just a couple other books and references that I wanted to incorporate to give a bit of perspective. Now, I gotta say, it's very obvious these are my opinions, and this is my very, very narrow experience of very, very big companies. So do take it with a pinch of salt. But at the same time, as well as giving a little bit of reference, having briefly done some consultancy work with IKEA, I also thought, you can't really go anywhere without discussing, Clayton Christensen's book on the innovator's dilemma. But I thought I'd actually contribute that with, I think, a considerably less well-known book by Gordon MacKenzie called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. So feel free to pun, obviously, from my hair. But I think it gives, a less, shall we say, academic, contrast to what it's like, not just observing how big companies are, but actually as an individual, how do you sort of hack your way into an organization successfully? As with all books, some rules translate to you as an individual. Some you realize you read the book again and think I totally missed the mark and didn't get it. But nonetheless, I thought, for the sake of 5 books, I kind of feel you could do a lot worse than this when sizing up whether it's a good choice for your future career in design. I'll try and do another video on what it's like in startups. Again, just my perspective, but let's jump right in. So I will move some of these books to one side. It's looking like a pinata with all these post-it notes. But anyway, so as it happens, I think I've given my copy of James Dyson's autobiography or biography away. But the next best thing is actually this induction book that I got, which, without sounding rude, covers very much the same material, but with a slightly more personal twist. So I think it's actually kind of relevant. So safe to say what was really great is I think I ended up having a really good experience at Dyson because I had 2 years of grappling with the transition from coming out of university to moving into a professional organization, which is, extremely dedicated on getting things right, engineered well, testing, etc. I mean, much of Dyson's business is dependent on whether a claim is technically correct as being better than competitors. So let's just say it definitely sharpens you not to sort of, faff around or sort of cut corners. So you could say a little bit contrasting to a startup, which is, should we say, allowed to sort of play a little bit more fast and loose as it hasn't got an established brand. But either way, Dyson has really moved through a lot of that journey. And there's some good lessons here. And dare I say it, like Dyson's a nice company. If you're in the UK, there isn't Apple yet on your doorstep, although I think there's some good plans in London. But I kind of feel it's one of those things where you can definitely get a pretty all-round experience of what it's like to design products. The other side of it, then after that 2 years, I moved into what's called new product innovation. And there I feel, I was really getting to sort of like sink my teeth into creative projects and went from sort of just being a member of a big team of, say, 30 to actually being like one of 2 key designers who designed the AM10 humidifier. And that was like, when I look back, I kind of, arrogantly took it for granted, and look back now and think, wow, that was a hell of an opportunity. So again, I'm extremely grateful to Dyson and the mentors and people who nurtured me through, no doubt a hefty amount of arrogance and entitlement that comes with the package of leaving university with a lot of hope and ambitions. And dare I say, usually quite a lot of fear and insecurity, if we're completely honest with ourselves. But I guess that's what's nice about age. People know that that's what's going on inside you. You're not actually that bad a person, or at least I hope that was the intention. So anyway, there's some nice lessons from the Dyson story of, this is sort of famously the Hoover ex-vice president who said, well, we should have just bought the Dyson technology, the IP or whatever, put it on a shelf, and then basically made sure it doesn't go out in the market, which would have enlightened customers that there was something better than bagged vacuum cleaners. So as much as I take it with a pinch of salt that this is, Dyson perpetuating its brand and its side of the story. Mike's not being asked for a quote here. I think nonetheless that sort of underdog spirit and that, you know, willingness to challenge things and maybe sort of see the bigger picture, I think is, dare I say it, sort of a bit of an integral part, whether you're in a corporate organization or a startup indeed. So for anyone who didn't know the backstory, it's safe to say that it's kind of interesting that Dyson took the sort of creative leap from these big cyclonic separators that have been around in wood factories for years as they spin out all the wood chips and dust and clean the air from factories. So it's kind of nice, just even the sort of the fact that he had jumped up on a roof and made preliminary sketches from this. I'm not recommending that, I'm sure he's not either. But at the same time, you know, nothing beats a good story down the pub. And I think, dare I say it, if you're doing things like this and you realise they are quite funny, it's kind of nice just to remember to like keep that notebook, because you never know when that might be called upon. I think, to be fair to Dyson as well, he doesn't paint himself as this lone genius. The whole company is festooned with people like Buckminster the Fuller, Alex Asagonis of the fame of Mini. The place has huge references to design history and inspiration and that sort of, you know, in this case, wrong thinking, doing things that are counterintuitive. Of course, there's a little bit of reality check that you can't just, you know, operate on the wrong thinking every single day of the week. Things need to be in moderation. There needs to be, you know, counterparts that are necessary for running an international organization. But nonetheless, I think, you know, certainly keeping in touch with a lot of people, it's certainly not dead at Dyson by any means. And indeed, rightly or wrongly, with the recent car manufacturing, there's still a lot of intent to make that as successful as possible. And I think it shows a hell of a lot more guts than a lot of industries just following the dotted line. So yeah, I think Dyson still lives through actually the fabled fail fast, you know, fail better mentality, whereas a lot of people just pay it lip service and hope that someone else takes the risk. So I think, to be fair to Dyson, they still do embody a lot of that belief and spirit. And of course, where would we be without the you know, the counterintuitive thinking that the dust was visible? And even though one side of, you know, conventional knowledge and wisdom would say this is icky and horrible, I think a lot of people, you know, came to realize this is actually sort of a weird, you know, slightly, you know, hidden fascination that we kind of like to see the stuff that we've picked up in our house before getting rid of it. I'm sure they're still working on a way to empty bins without it being too messy, but there's always going to be pros and cons with a new design. And dare I say, one of the things that isn't often spoke about at Dyson is, I'm sure it wouldn't always be considered a pioneer of equality between genders, but I'm sure if we look at the statistics, it's probably pretty fair to say Dyson as a brand has got more men to change their perspective of domestic chores than anything else I can think of, at least. So I would certainly say there's some interesting things to maybe take a look at that go beyond the conventional aspects of the brand. So a bit of fun there. And then I think there's just some nice stories of, you know, when you know, there's a lot of like when life hands you a lemon, make lemonade. And so, you know, Dyson was given all these, you know, caveats on what he can and can't say on a particular advertising. And so he just used the blanks, which are of course decipherable by anyone with common sense. And indeed, even if they weren't, they allude to something that was kind of fun and provocative. And so I think that spirit still leaves on, and certainly to a lot of people who've even left the company and gone to great companies. I was seeing one last week with two excellent engineers, and that's sort of, you know, we both realise how much of a debt we owe to Dyson and the mentoring and that rigour and that challenger attitude. So I think Dyson is still overwhelmingly a good place to work, even though I'm sure it's not right for everyone. I think it can be a great starting place. So another one, again, haven't worked for IKEA for anything longer than a very intensive week out in Almholt, but it was still an incredible experience. And I think this book is available, I think, at IKEA, not available on Amazon or any of these things. But it's safe to say that they are deeply invested in materials, and, you know, much of their innovation comes from having a deep affinity with the tools, the materials, the process, and of course, it's heavily sophisticated on cost and how to get the most bang for their buck when making something. So I think, very few design graduates would suffer from working for a company like that. And of course, nice bit of travel. So again, Almhout actually is this green. It is kind of weird when you travel out there. It really feels like typical Scandinavian, huge, slightly boring exterior, but extremely nice and light and functional on the inside. And then of course with a lot of nature surround it. This phrase democratic design is something that comes up a lot about, sort of combining form, function, quality, sustainability, and a low price. And I think, dare I say it, all of the first four feel very laudable when you're at university, but actually low price, let's just be real, that's where IKEA started, is being extremely competitive with its price, as well as having good design, etc. So I think let's not sort of skip to the end, that there is always a journey. And so how you start as a student, I think, is quite indelibly influenced by some of the formative experiences. So I think as well, having strangely done a bit of a light bulb project when I was in Hong Kong, I actually have quite a lot of respect for this, that they had looked at the LED manufacturing of light bulbs, realised that essentially there's a ton of components here which could be importantly costed down and improved upon and made more efficient. So this at a glance looks almost identical to this when you're looking at it, but this is the difference between making a huge impact on cost. And so it's all very well to talk about energy saving and sustainability, but actually it requires a company to put the R&D in to get from A to B. And so I think, as much as startups can be very, sexy and show that they're pushing all these sorts of boundaries, actually the big change can be when a huge company that has a big footprint on these problems actually takes a positive step. And so, dare I say it, you could make a big change in a small company, or you could make a small change in a very big company that has a very big impact. So again, kind of choice is yours. I think as well, there's just, I noticed that a lot of IKEA, sure, I'm sure every item in there is not designed to suit every person. That's kind of the point. But I think there is a consistency running through it. And when you're, certainly if I speak for myself at university, I would like to think that my design was harmonious and had a sort of a true consistency between it. But looking back, of course, that really wasn't the case. But I think there's a lot to learn from companies like IKEA, where their products really do just look like IKEA products. And it's almost hard to decode that. And I think when you spend time at a company, that time just being immersed in something does mean you begin to decode it for the better. So I think it's super interesting. Again, there's really nice little projects here. I don't know whether you've seen this thing where there's CNC milled sort of sockets and connections that just basically bang in with a hammer and lock all these different furniture together. I'm sure there's probably some truth in that. I haven't seen these prevalent everywhere, so it's probably something that's still a little bit work in progress. But nonetheless, I think IKEA is still really very experimental in this, and certainly pushing a lot more boundaries than most companies. And then I think as well, it's sort of a bit like Dyson. It's not afraid to admit that sometimes it's really got it totally wrong. But again, it doesn't sort of throw the designers or indeed themselves under the bus for creating this. There were still quite important lessons and learnings that were taken from this that became positive and beneficial to the company. So I think, again, it's all very easy to give a TED talk or whatever saying the power of failure, but the truth is it hurts when you're a designer. It hurts to be told that was a failure. It hurts to be the manager who signed off on that project for the design team, and their bonus and, of course, ego is going to be dented as a result of that. And how do you come back from that positively? I think, dare I say, for something that occupies very few pages, there's actually a lot of emotion in that for most people who've had a career that's longer than just a couple of years. And again, I think looking towards the future, I think they've done some really nice stuff. It's of course interesting to see, without giving too much away of what was in the workshop, what's cooking in the future, what's the future of X. I think is truly a question that lives and breathes in the minds of the creative teams at IKEA. And I think it's really exciting that they go beyond just what's the future of, a saucepan, to what is the future of the entire cooking experience as we know it. What is the future of food, indeed? And I think those sorts of questions they really do go for, and it was a huge pleasure and privilege to work with them. So again, a lot of questions about Lego. Again, I think there's I'm always surprised actually people who say what's it like working at Lego, and you realize you've got nowhere near enough time to explain that to them, or you risk giving a glib answer. I cannot recommend reading this book enough. I would also say, having worked at it and even asked people who've worked at Lego, what do you think of this book? Everybody, including myself, would say, of course, take this with a pinch of salt. It is still written, some years ago, and of course, this is just one person's, two people's, best efforts to do justice to something which, of course, involves quite literally tens of thousands of people. And of course, there are going to be some things that are filtered, so it's a little bit read between the lines some days with these sorts of books. But I think overwhelmingly, if you read this, you're not going to walk into Lego with any big shocks as to how they work, how they think, etc. But to give a taste, I think it's very interesting to sort of point that I think Lego performs very well in a crisis. Indeed, I think a lot of companies, it sharpens their mind that this is a graph of Lego's profits spiraling down as the number of new toys were introduced, yet Lego sales were consistent. So it was kind of getting to the point of they were going in too much innovation in too many directions with not enough focus. Was a big taking from that. And there's actually a book called Profit from the Core, which I don't know whether was explicitly used as one of the things that helped turn the company around. But I feel it's unlikely that it wasn't an influence to someone in the company. So just my speculation there. But again, I think the other thing, it goes through some sort of, bumps and honesty of what happened. I mean, no surprises, we're on chapter 3, it turned it around, spoiler, and ended up doing, considerably better as a result of some things. Not least to mention things like Star Wars and Harry Potter franchises. So as much as, of course, Lego is about all the great things of having a pile of bricks, open-ended creativity and play, there's also a lot of people who just need help getting on that first rung of the ladder with a play theme that they can relate to and immerse themselves in quickly. And I think what's important for me, the learning from that, wasn't to be, should we say, sneery or aloof, that people needed help to get into creative play. Just because I was a kid who didn't need a franchise to get me thinking creatively, I do see that just as with cooking, or something where I wasn't necessarily instantly like a duck to water, it actually helped to have some recipes to follow and help establish some of the learning and the tools. So I think, dare I say it, I came, from the graduate perspective, and having worked at the company, I came to have a lot more humility to why, the general public needs hand-holding. And I think that's always a good journey for a designer to go through. And would recommend that you enter Lego with that respect for the necessity for the company to do these incredible altruistic things through things like Lego Foundation and Lego Education. It is still underpinned by a huge financial machine, and that has to make sense. It's not a charity, it's a business. So I think another thing that's interesting is just it goes through this idea that after a while you keep getting great ideas and all these Lego elements, in other words different types of bricks, was getting really, really high but not necessarily yielding new profits. And so again, this profit from the core principle of stripping back to the essentials wasn't just about business consolidation. I think in terms of brand, it was incredibly powerful to help the company focus. And indeed, let's be honest, creatives won't always admit it, but a little bit of creative constraint can actually bring out the best. And I think a good example here was this Lego fire truck, which at one point it was kind of getting, this isn't my words, this is in the book, saying, this doesn't even look like a fire truck. And actually, of course, kids occasionally want a futuristic space, whatever, but actually most kids, when they want a fire truck, they want it to look like a fire truck from the real world. And this isn't just, a adult perspective. This is very much like developmental child psychology of that very young kids are trying to emulate and understand and process the real world. So it makes sense for the fire truck to look like a fire truck and be like a fire truck. Of course, we hope that we move into enlightened subtleties, like not all fire people are firemen, and that there are fire women. I think Lego has made some great steps on things like that. But again, I think overwhelmingly trying to understand when are you representing a particular type of experience for a target audience, and when are you looking at older children or even adults, and you can push a lot more creative boundaries. So I think, again, understanding it as not a black and white but a journey. I think Lego's an incredible learning place for that, whether you work there or whether you even just read the book and reflect on some of these things, and as I said, read between the lines. I think, as I mentioned with Dyson, I think it's sort of become popular and indeed sensible to own up to some of the mistakes. I think Lego has a few things which, you know, just really didn't work, and were sort of in hindsight considered a bit of a wrong turn. But as always, you speak to the people in the creative teams who maybe worked on these, and they're like, yeah, you know, that it didn't quite work on this bit, but actually we learned a lot of stuff, and that's why this new thing is actually so successful. So I'm not going to necessarily get into that. I think that's a little bit internal knowledge. But let's just say not everything that was burnt in the flames didn't have some degree of phoenix that came from it. And I think good design managers know that, that you don't burn everything and forget about the past. And I think the same thing with games. You know, there was things that were, you know, a little bit difficult about all these things, but, you know, it yielded some really important understandings, I'm sure, for the creative team, borrowing from an industry that really understood the mechanics, and this phrase, game mechanics, is an important thing that's very different from, say, building mechanics. And so being able to intertwine those two strands, I think, was a really important thing for Lego to learn as part of its sort of creative DNA. You know, creativity is not just about building blocks. You know, it's about systematic thinking. It's about story. It's about narrative. It's about what things you build for yourself, what things you build for others. And of course, that in turn has empathy and qualities like this. So I can go on and on and on, and it's not here to be a polemic about Lego, but dare I say it, you know, I see a lot more depth in some of their tangential things than necessarily there's always times to put in a PR campaign. And so I think this book goes some way to helping with that. And indeed, Bionicle, again, is one of those sort of complex histories like Star Wars, where it looks to the consumer as if, hey, wasn't that successful? Good. But actually it was a very tortuous and complex path to get people there. I think, again, you know, when you look at Mindstorms, it's not a surprise at all to say that if you imagine making this out of bricks with no electronics, it would be very cheap. If you put all the electronics in, it suddenly becomes very expensive. And indeed, how does a company reconcile that with a target audience? That in itself is a very interesting journey and worth a lot of scrutiny. And it goes to say, Mindstorms was not something where the company just got out of bed and said, yeah, we're an electronic building company. So without getting too much into the battles and the the naysayers that understandably are in the company and the hopes and fears, it's safe to say that this was a hard-won battle, and one that I think the company should be extraordinarily proud for, as it has helped elevate it beyond just the brick, and indeed paves a sort of legacy that means it can innovate in new ways, in new directions in future, and stay relevant to kids, even if it still is exceptionally good at making plastic bricks. Or indeed, I say asterisk, plastic, who knows what it might be. Something which of course has been in the news lately, of Lego looking at sustainable alternatives. So again, there is that anticipation that Lego, if anyone, is going to try. Again, there's some really nice stories of, you know, the wisdom of the crowd is a phrase that's, you know, often cited for looking at sort of crowdsourced innovation, but also the wisdom of an individual, I think, is something where Lego has done very well, in that this was just, you know, quite literally one man's dogged pursuit to do an architectural series. No spoilers, but it's kind of obvious, safe to say it wasn't just turn the key and it happened. It was years and years of dedication and him pushing and explaining and repitching, but ultimately it's a very successful range, and indeed paved the way, I'm sure, for a lot more of the adult fans of Lego expansion of the brand to the point where you see sports cars and things like this nowadays. Again, I think what's really nice, Lego has the humility to put some notes which I think are very pointed in how it was perceived and how it evolved over time, not least Innovator's Dilemma, which I put here in one of the notes. So I say read any of those. And of course, I'm not going to go through blow by blow Innovator's Dilemma of, very sadly, the late Clayton Christensen. I don't think I could add anything, but for anyone who hasn't seen this book, it's a lot about saying how can companies ultimately work between this dilemma, which is that if you continue to innovate on sustained things which you know about the current market, chances are you're going to rest on your laurels and die. And at the same time, if you work too much in disruptive technology, you will spend a lot of money, R&D, doing stuff that you don't know whether the market truly is or isn't going to like it. And as much as it might feel very futuristic, it doesn't mean that people are necessarily going to pay the price that will offset the innovation commitment. And so what is the ratio of that is healthy in a company? And so dare I say it, it is not a book that is just going to sort of tell you the answers straight away, but it gives a lot of very, very good case studies, which is what this guy did for many, many years, reviewed all these different case studies and companies, and you see things like the technology of the camera, digital camera, start off being very, very poor in phones. No competition at all to the 35mm camera world, or even the digital camera world for that matter, for a long time. And then, of course, they got better. And one of the great phrases you hear from many cameramen or camerawomen is, what is the best camera? The camera you've got on you. And there is some truth in that was the disruption. If you are out, whitewater rafting or in a club or, out with your friends in town, you haven't actually got usually a single lens reflex camera that's big and bulky and heavy. You've got your smartphone. And so there's huge disruption with this. And following similar metaphors or parallels, we have things like Wikipedia, Google Maps, Skype, Netflix, Airbnb, Amazon Kindle. All those sorts of things came, you could say, from nowhere. But actually, if you sort of follow technology trends, you can say that there was definitely warning signs. And was there a risk that big companies ignored these warning signs? And that is very much the caution that he deploys towards big companies, and indeed the invitation towards startups to be that disruption. Because the great thing about having a big brand is that you're known for doing a thing well. The downside is that if you do anything other than that thing, it's a little weird and hard to sort of pitch and pivot. The downside of being a startup, of course, is no one knows what you do, no one knows whether you're any good, but you have very little to lose because no one has expectations of you. So again, he proposes, how do you gear those two things effectively? And indeed, can you sometimes bring them together when they're both at the receptivity to incorporate into a bigger company or grow and scale, or indeed, big enough that they've really ironed out some of the bumps and they're not just, flaky and haphazard, as early startups, of course, are at the very beginnings. So I think, again, it's a really interesting book, and I think one that complements all of these journeys in some great companies without being negative, but just sometimes a bit real about what it is. I think it's fair to say that this is very much an academic's perspective. It's very analytical. There's a lot of text, tables, charts. It's that kind of thing. In contrast, I don't often see this book referenced, which I guess this is kind of as I mentioned, my shtick on doing book reviews is I'm trying to do something other than one book is great. What is a sort of, should we say, a balanced diet? And I think the nice one that I wanted to finish on is this was someone who had worked at Hallmark Cards, which was very big in its time. And Gordon MacKenzie wanted to go through essentially what it was like trying to be a rebel in a very big organization. And the clue is in the name, orbiting the giant hairball. If the hairball is the organization, how do you orbit in a way that allows you to benefit from that huge company's power and brand equity, but at the same time be something that the company can go to or you can go to it and add value in a way that isn't disrupting either of either sort of, should we say, planet's individuality and necessities to exist. So he's basically saying, how does a creative rebel work with a, slightly more regimented, straight line company? And I think it's a really nice, contrast to the dryness of this. In all honesty, it gives a little bit more color and a bit more flamboyance. Of course, it's not as rigorous, and it's very much for you to sort of make it your own, rather than it feel like something that is robust and tested. This is one person's journey, but I think, dare I say it, there's a lot that I would relate to, and I think many of us do as well. So I think as well, there's just some nice things of him sort of saying he goes often on these journeys where someone in the company who he initially has a bit of a reaction to is telling him how it is, and he rejects it because it doesn't feel creative or fun or sexy. And then it's about him sometimes coming to terms with that truth and that reality, but then trying to then be able to work with that person to change together. And I think that is the wisdom of the book, is not saying that either person was right. It's that there's something in that marriage if you can get that odd coupling to work. So again, he sort of, I won't show too much because I don't want to sort of breach any IP here, but he tells like lots of these little stories or anecdotes which are quite comical and memorable, like chickens and lines, and saying, if you draw a line in chalk and put the chicken's head next to it, it will basically hold it there as if it's hypnotized. It's kind of a weird phenomena that seems to happen with chickens. But, he was getting into the discussion of sort of like, yeah, that's what it's like. These are all the rules of being in a company, and you've just stuck your head to it and you can't move. But of course then, how do we get there? Why is it those rules exist? And I think it's his ability to be kind of snarky, but at the same time then have a bit of humility about himself as a, crazy creative who's going to change everything, and then saying, but what's the consequences of me being this person in an organization? What is the right balance of crazy to conservatism? What is the right balance of new stuff to just getting the job done? And so I think it's, it looks like a bit of a silly, flippant book, but I think there's actually quite a lot of humility and honesty coming from this, which is why I do recommend it. And again, it's sort of, sometimes it can feel a bit Yoda in skydiving without a parachute is suicide, total freedom is suicide. Similarly, holding up in a closet is vegetating, total security is vegetating. I appreciate it's a little bit Yoda wisdom, but I think he makes some effort to go on to unbox what it's like in a corporate creative culture. So I think it goes beyond just the glib maxims. So again, I think there's like a few things which I think, strangely, I was reading this as a corporate thing, but actually was using it whilst in a startup, ironically, at Sugru. And I think sometimes just reframing things was a really interesting wake-up call for me. And I thought a nice example to finish, that these milk cans, he really wanted to buy them because he thought they'd just be really cool waste paper bins. And it sounds crazy, but the sort of office stationery budget said you can't afford to buy milk cans, even though they're only like whatever $10 more expensive than the fancy pre-prescribed waste paper bins. And so of course it's a little bit hipster, it's a little bit unnecessary to fight to the death for a milk can, one of these milk churns. But he realized that actually if he changed the budget from being office stationery and things like this to, is it allowed to be considered art that is functional, then for some reason it was the cheapest art in the world and it was signed off immediately. And it's literally buying the same thing from a different budget. And I'm not trying to say that, corporates always behave this way and that you can always pull the wool over some people's eyes. But I think it's also fair to say that sometimes, bureaucratic processes, if you just keep slamming your head against the wall on one point, you might miss the fact that there's actually an easy workaround just by changing gear a little bit. And so I think he uses that as a metaphor that is very silly and flippant, but ultimately gets into that way of thinking of how do you sometimes be creative in your way of actually tackling the problem of being in a corporate or indeed a startup organization where it's not all about you every day of the week. It's about harmonizing that. So I hope that's useful, an oversight of Dyson, IKEA, Lego through the lens of an academic, robust process through one man's crazy opinions on what it's like to maybe get the best out of both of the experiences and mature and grow a little as well. So I hope that's a useful collection. Please throw down some comments or any other suggestions. I'd really love to see them. Thanks a lot. Bye.